Sometimes life doesn't just knock you down. It takes everything you ever loved and leaves you with nothing but the clothes on your back. For Dominic Lawson, a 46-year-old single father, that moment came when he lost his wife, his home, and nearly lost his daughter too. He was living in his truck with $50 to his name when he made a choice that everyone said was crazy. He bought an abandoned church at a county auction for exactly that amount. The building was falling apart, covered in vines, and the locals warned him to stay away. But Dominic needed a fresh start. Then he began clearing the cemetery behind the church and discovered something strange: freshly dug graves with no bodies inside. What was hidden beneath that old church, and why? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dominic Lawson hadn't always been the kind of man who slept in his truck and counted pennies for gas money. There was a time, not so long ago really, when he'd been the kind of father who coached Little League on weekends, the kind of husband who brought flowers home on Fridays, the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard and loved harder, everything would turn out fine. That was before Cora died. It happened on a Tuesday morning in April 2 years back. She'd been making breakfast, humming along to the radio like she always did when the aneurysm hit. By the time Dominic got her to the hospital, she was already gone. The doctor said it was quick, that she didn't suffer. They said it like that was supposed to be a comfort, like the speed of it somehow made the loss less devastating. It didn't. Cora had been his center, the calm eye in whatever storm life threw at them. Without her, Dominic simply fell apart. He stopped showing up to his job as a construction foreman, stopped returning phone calls, stopped doing much of anything except sitting in their bedroom, holding her pillow, breathing in the fading scent of her lavender shampoo. Their daughter Jocelyn tried to hold things together. At 21, she'd just started her senior year of college, studying journalism with dreams of changing the world, one story at a time. Instead, she found herself dropping classes to come home, trying to pull her father out of his grief, trying to keep the bills paid with her part-time waitressing job. But grief is expensive, and so is living. The mortgage payments fell behind. The collection calls started. Jocelyn begged him to snap out of it, to fight, to be the father she needed. But Dominic couldn't find his way back. He was drowning, and he didn't have the strength to reach for the lifeline she was throwing. 6 months after Cora's death, the bank foreclosed on their house. That's when Jocelyn's patience finally broke. She moved in with a friend across town, and the look in her eyes when she left, disappointment mixed with something harder, something that looked like contempt, cut deeper than anything else. She'd lost her mother, and now, in a way, she'd lost her father too. "I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore," she'd said, standing in the driveway with her suitcase. "When you decide to be a person again, call me." She hadn't called him since. He'd tried reaching out a few times, but his messages went unanswered. At 23 now, Jocelyn had her own life, her own struggles. She didn't need a broken father weighing her down. So Dominic did what broken men do. He drifted. He took odd jobs when he could find them, slept in his truck when he couldn't afford a motel, and tried not to think too hard about how far he'd fallen. His savings dwindled to almost nothing. His last paycheck from a week-long roofing job left him with exactly $50 after he'd paid for gas and a few meals. That's when he saw the notice at a rest stop bulletin board. County tax auction, Milldale next Saturday. He didn't know why he drove there. Milldale was 3 hours west, a town he'd never heard of in a part of the state he'd never visited. But something pulled him there anyway, some instinct he couldn't name, some feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was where he needed to be. Milldale turned out to be the kind of town time had forgotten. Main Street was lined with boarded-up shops and faded awnings. The few businesses still open, a diner, a hardware store, a post office, looked like they were hanging on by sheer stubbornness. The people Dominic saw moved slowly, eyeing him with the particular wariness small towns reserve for strangers. The auction was held in the county courthouse, a limestone building with columns that had probably been impressive a century ago. Now it just looked tired. Maybe a dozen people sat in folding chairs, most of them looking bored, as the auctioneer droned through parcels of land nobody wanted. Then came Lot 47, St. Jerome's Church, built 1891, abandoned since 1974, 1 acre including the structure and cemetery. Starting bid, $50. Dominic sat up straighter. $50! That was exactly what he had. The auctioneer waited. No one raised a hand. The room was silent, except for someone coughing in the back. $50, Dominic heard himself say. Heads turned. The county clerk, a thin woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, peered at him over her glasses. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Audra Pemberton. You sure about that, son? The auctioneer asked. That old church is in rough shape. Real rough. $50, Dominic repeated. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward, her voice low but carrying. That property has a history. Not a good one. You might want to reconsider. But Dominic was already standing, already walking to the front to hand over his last $50 in cash. The auctioneer shrugged, counted the bills, and stamped the papers. Just like that, Dominic Lawson owned a church. After the auction, he stopped at the only diner in town, Floyd's Place, according to the hand-painted sign. Inside, it smelled like coffee and bacon grease. A handful of locals sat at the counter, their conversation dying the moment Dominic walked in. The owner, a heavy-set man in his 60s with kind eyes and weathered hands, nodded from behind the counter. Help you? Coffee, please, Dominic said, sliding onto a stool. And maybe directions to St. Jerome's Church. The diner went completely silent. Floyd, it had to be Floyd, poured the coffee slowly, his expression thoughtful. You're the one who bought that place. Just did. Son, I'm going to give you some free advice along with this coffee. Floyd set the cup down carefully. Some places are empty for a reason. Some doors are better left closed. I just need a roof, Dominic said quietly. That's all? Floyd studied him for a long moment, and something in Dominic's face must have softened him, because he sighed and pulled out a napkin to draw a rough map. East on County Road 12, about 3 miles. Can't miss it, only church out there. Just be careful. That's all I'm saying. The church was exactly where Floyd said it would be, set back from the road behind a wrought iron fence choked with vines. St. Jerome's had probably been beautiful once. Red brick with white trim. A bell tower reaching toward the sky, stained glass windows that would have caught the morning light just right. Now it was a ruin. The vines had claimed most of the exterior walls. Several windows were broken. The front steps sagged dangerously. The bell tower listed slightly to the left, like an old man with a bad hip. But it had a roof. That was something. Dominic pushed through the creaking door into the nave. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming through the broken windows. Old pews sat in crooked rows, their wood warped and split. At the front, where an altar should have been, there was only empty space and debris. On the wall hung a portrait, surprisingly intact. A stern-looking priest in dark robes, his eyes seeming to follow Dominic as he walked down the aisle. No nameplate, just those watchful eyes. That first night, Dominic swept a corner clear, rolled out his sleeping bag, and lay there listening to the building settle and creak around him. The truck had been cramped and cold. This was cold too and drafty, but it was a roof, his roof. Before he fell asleep, he pulled out a pen and paper and wrote a letter he wasn't sure he'd ever send. Dear Jocelyn, I know you don't want to hear from me. I know I let you down, but I bought a church today, yes, a whole church, and I'm going to fix it up. I'm going to make something good out of it. Maybe make something good out of myself again too. I'm sorry for everything. I love you, Dad. He folded the letter, tucked it into his pocket, and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters and whispering through the broken windows. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the church, Dominic could have sworn he heard footsteps on gravel. But he was too tired to investigate, too tired to do anything but sleep. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd start making this place into something. Tomorrow, he'd start putting the pieces back together. He had no idea what was waiting for him in the cemetery behind the church, or what secrets lay buried beneath his feet. Morning came cold and grey. Dominic woke to the sound of crows arguing in the trees outside, and his back protesting every movement. He'd slept on harder surfaces in the past months, but not by much. Still, as he sat up and looked around the dusty nave, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose, however small. He spent the first few hours doing basic cleanup, sweeping debris from the floor, boarding up the worst of the broken windows with scraps of plywood he found in what must have once been a storage room. Testing the old hand pump out back, surprised and grateful when it coughed up rusty water that eventually ran clear. By noon, he'd worked up enough courage to explore the cemetery. It sprawled behind the church, maybe half an acre of weathered headstones and overgrown grass that reached past his knees. A rusted iron fence marked the perimeter, its gate hanging crooked on broken hinges. Dominic counted 23 headstones as he waded through the brambles and weeds, their inscriptions worn smooth by time and weather. The dates ranged from the 1890s to the 1960s. Most were simple markers, names, dates, nothing more. A few had brief epitaphs: beloved mother, rest in peace, gone but not forgotten. The irony of that last one struck him. They'd all been forgotten, really, left to time and weather and the slow creep of nature reclaiming what had once been tended ground. Dominic decided the cemetery would be his first real project. He'd clear it, restore what dignity he could to this abandoned place. It felt right somehow, honoring these forgotten dead. Maybe it was his way of honoring Cora, too, of making up for the months he'd spent too broken to even visit her grave. He found a rusted shovel leaning against one of the larger monuments, its wooden handle surprisingly solid despite the years. Carved into the handle were the initials FM. He used it to start hacking away at the worst of the undergrowth. That's when he found the first one. A rectangular patch of earth, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, where the grass grew differently. Newer, greener. The soil looked disturbed, settled, but not settled enough. Like something had been dug up recently, then filled back in. Dominic's pulse quickened. He moved through the cemetery more carefully now, looking for other signs. He found 5 more identical patches scattered among the old graves. 6 in total, all the same size, all showing recent disturbance. His hands were shaking as he pushed the shovel into the first patch. The soil gave easily, too easily. He dug carefully, expecting to hit a casket, remains, something. But there was nothing. Just empty earth going down maybe 4 feet before hitting the harder, undisturbed clay beneath. He checked another patch, then another, all empty. 6 grave-shaped holes that had been dug, then filled back in, but never used. Why would someone dig graves and leave them empty? Dominic's mind raced through possibilities. Cemetery maintenance? But why dig and refill? Preparation for future burials? But this place had been abandoned for decades. Who would be preparing graves here now? He needed answers. The county office would have records, burial permits, something that might explain this. The drive back to town took 20 minutes, giving Dominic time to talk himself through what he'd found. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe he was jumping to conclusions. But the tight knot in his stomach suggested otherwise. Mrs. Pemberton looked up from her desk as he entered the county office, her expression cooling the moment she recognized him. "Mr. Lawson, what can I do for you?" "I found some disturbed earth in the cemetery," Dominic said carefully. "Recent digging. I was wondering if there are any records of burials at St. Jerome's in the past few months." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That church has been decommissioned since 1974. No burials have been authorized there in over 50 years. But someone's been digging, perhaps vandals, perhaps animals. Old cemeteries attract all sorts of disturbances." Her tone suggested the conversation was over. "If you're concerned, file a report with Sheriff Tate." She turned back to her paperwork, dismissing him. But Dominic had seen something flicker in her eyes, not confusion or concern, but something closer to alarm. She knew something. That night, back at the church, Dominic couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old building set his nerves on edge. Around midnight, he heard something that definitely wasn't the wind. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling the church. He moved to a window, careful to stay in shadow. In the moonlight, he could make out a figure moving through the cemetery, stopping at each of the disturbed patches. The figure crouched down, seemed to examine the ground, then moved to the next spot. Dominic's heart hammered. He should go out there, confront whoever it was. But something held him back, maybe caution, maybe fear. Instead, he watched until the figure finished its circuit and disappeared into the trees beyond the cemetery fence. He didn't sleep after that. Morning brought another discovery. Fresh footprints in the mud near the cemetery gate, bootprints size 10 or 11 with a distinctive worn heel, and in the church itself, muddy tracks leading from the door to the center of the nave. Someone had been inside while he slept. Dominic followed the tracks. They led to a spot in the floor he'd swept clean the day before. Now looking closer, he noticed something he'd missed, a slight gap between floorboards, forming a rectangle about 3 feet square. He knelt down, running his fingers along the edges. One of the boards was loose. He pried it up carefully, and beneath it, set into the stone foundation, was an iron ring. His breath caught. The ring was attached to something, a door, a hatch, something hidden beneath the church floor. He worked at the other boards, pulling them up one by one, revealing a wooden trapdoor, sealed with layers of old paint and rust. Dominic sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery. Every instinct told him this was what someone didn't want him to find. The empty graves, the nighttime visitor, Mrs. Pemberton's evasiveness, it all connected to whatever was beneath this door. He pulled out his phone, barely any signal out here but enough, and called the only number he'd promised himself he wouldn't call unless it was important. Jocelyn answered on the 4th ring. "Dad!" Just hearing her voice cracked something open in his chest. "Hey, sweetheart, I know you don't want to hear from me, but are you okay?" The concern in her voice gave him hope. "I'm fine. I'm at this church I bought. I know that sounds crazy, but I found something. Something strange. And I wanted someone to know in case what? In case I'm not being paranoid." He laughed, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "There's a trapdoor under the church. Empty graves out back. Someone's been watching the place." Silence on the other end. Then quietly, "Dad, are you safe?" "I think so. I'm going to open the trapdoor tomorrow, see what's down there. I just wanted you to know where I am. In Milldale, at St. Jerome's Church. Don't open it alone." Her voice was firm now, the old Jocelyn coming through. "Promise me you won't open it alone." "I promise." He paused. "I miss you, Jocelyn." Another silence, softer this time. "I miss you too. Just be careful, okay?" After she hung up, Dominic stared at the trapdoor. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd find out what secret St. Jerome's was hiding. He spent the rest of the night sitting watch, the shovel with the initials FM across his lap, waiting for footsteps that never came. Dawn arrived with a soft rain that pattered against the church's roof and filled the air with the smell of wet earth. Dominic had managed maybe an hour of real sleep, his body finally giving in to exhaustion just before sunrise. When he woke stiff and sore, his first thought was of the trapdoor. He made himself wait. Boiled water on the small camping stove he'd brought from the truck. Made instant coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard, but gave him the caffeine he needed. Ate a protein bar that had been sitting in his glove compartment for who knew how long. Only then did he approach the trapdoor, crowbar in hand. The iron ring was cold to the touch. He pulled hard, straining against rust and time. The door fought him, groaning in protest, but finally gave way with a shriek of metal on metal. Dust billowed up from below, making him cough and step back. When the air cleared, he saw stone steps descending into darkness. Dominic clicked on his flashlight, another item from the truck, batteries thankfully still good, and started down. 15 steps, steep and narrow, led to a cellar carved from stone and earth. The space was larger than he'd expected, maybe 15 feet by 20, with the ceiling just tall enough for him to stand upright. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, warped with age and moisture. On them sat boxes, ledgers, stacks of papers yellow with time. In one corner stood a small writing desk, its surface covered in a film of dust. An inkwell sat beside a cup holding dried-up quill pens. This had been someone's workspace, someone's hiding place. Dominic moved slowly through the space, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The boxes contained church records, baptisms, marriages, funerals, all meticulously documented in fading ink. He found ledgers recording donations, expenses, the mundane business of running a church that stretched back to the 1890s. At the desk, he found something different, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. He opened it carefully, afraid the brittle pages might crumble in his hands. The handwriting inside was precise, almost compulsive in its neatness. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 1957. This journal I begin not for my own remembrance, but as testimony. Should anyone find these words, know that I, Father Matthias Grayson, priest of St. Jerome's Church, carry a burden that weighs heavier with each passing day. There are truths in this town that must be preserved, even if they can never be spoken. Dominic's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Entry after entry detailed Father Matthias's daily life. Services conducted, parishioners counseled, repairs needed on the church. Ordinary things. But woven through it all was a thread of growing unease. March 1957. I have been researching the church archives, particularly the records from 1918. The numbers do not match. The official county records, the church ledger, they tell different stories. I must investigate further. June 1957. I spoke with Mrs. Adelaide Winters today. She is 93 and remembers the sickness that swept through Milldale. She calls it the time of silence. When I pressed her, she wept and begged me to leave the past alone. September 1957. I have found discrepancies that cannot be explained by simple bookkeeping errors. The church records from October and November 1918 are incomplete, pages torn out or burned. Why would Father Cornelius, my predecessor, destroy records? What was he hiding? Dominic read faster now, drawn into Father Matthias's growing obsession. January 1958. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed 47 people in Milldale, according to county records. But the church ledger before the missing pages listed 52 souls under quarantine care. Where are the other 5? Where did they go? The entries grew darker, more troubled. Father Matthias had clearly stumbled onto something that haunted him. May 1958, I confronted Mayor Garrett about the discrepancies. He became hostile, warned me that some questions were dangerous to ask. He said, "The dead are buried. Let them rest. But what if they're not buried? What if that's the whole problem?" Dominic's throat felt tight. He set down the journal and searched through the boxes more carefully. In one, he found a brittle newspaper clipping from November 1918, the Milldale Gazette. The headline read, "Influenza claims 47 lives. Town mourns its dead." The article described the devastating 3-week period when the Spanish flu had torn through the small community. It praised Father Cornelius Ashford for his tireless work caring for the sick, organizing quarantine measures, and performing last rites. A true shepherd to his flock, the article said. But something about the tone felt wrong, too clean, too neat, like a story that had been carefully edited. Dominic returned to the journal, skipping ahead to the final entries. August 1959, I can no longer serve this church in good conscience. The truth is buried here, literally and figuratively, and I lack the courage to excavate it. God forgive me, but I am a coward. I will leave Milldale at the end of the month and pray that someone braver than I will one day uncover what Father Cornelius and the town leaders did. The weight of their sin should not be mine alone to carry. The final entry was dated September 2nd, 1959. I am sealing this vault today. Everything I have learned, I leave here as testimony. They buried the truth with the dead, but truth has a way of rising. To whoever finds this, look beneath. Always look beneath. The journal ended there. No more entries. Dominic checked the church records and found that Father Matthias had indeed left. St. Jerome's in September 1959. The church had limped along with visiting priests for another 15 years before being abandoned entirely. Dominic climbed back up to the nave, his mind reeling. 52 people in quarantine, 47 official deaths, 5 missing from the record. And Father Matthias's cryptic warning, look beneath. He needed more information. Needed to see the actual county death records from 1918, not just newspaper articles. But Mrs. Pemberton had already made it clear she wouldn't help him. He sat in one of the old pews, the journal in his hands, and tried to think. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving everything damp and grey. Water dripped from the eaves with a steady rhythm that should have been soothing, but only reminded him of time passing. A knock at the door startled him so badly he nearly dropped the journal. He opened the door to find a man in a sheriff's uniform, tall and solid, probably in his early 50s. His badge read Virgil Tate. "Mr. Lawson, I'm Sheriff Tate. Mind if I come in?" Dominic stepped aside, suddenly very aware of the open trapdoor in the middle of the floor. Virgil's eyes went to it immediately. "Doing some exploring, I see." "It's my property," Dominic said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have a right to know what's on it." "That you do." Virgil walked slowly around the nave, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Thing is, some folks in town are a little concerned. You've been asking questions, poking around the cemetery. Now you're digging up cellars. People get nervous when strangers start disturbing things. I found empty graves out back," Dominic said. "Freshly dug and filled in. Don't you find that strange?" "Old cemetery maintenance," Virgil said smoothly. "Previous owner probably had some work done before the tax sale. The church has been abandoned for 50 years. Then vandals, kids messing around. Happens all the time." Virgil turned to face him fully. "My point is, Mr. Lawson, you're new here. You don't know the town, don't know its history. Sometimes it's best to just fix up your property and leave well enough alone. And if I don't—" Something hardened in Virgil's expression. "Then you might find that Milldale isn't as welcoming as you'd hoped. Building codes, safety inspections, permits. There's a lot of red tape that can make a man's life difficult if he's not careful." It wasn't quite a threat, but it was close enough. Dominic held the sheriff's gaze, refusing to look away first. Finally, Virgil sighed and headed for the door. "Just friendly advice, Mr. Lawson. This town has a long memory, and some things are better left in the past." After he left, Dominic went to check on his truck. All 4 tires had been slashed. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a note written in block letters, "Leave." Dominic stared at the slashed tires, anger and frustration warring in his chest. He had almost nothing left. This truck, this church, and a mystery that was starting to feel more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Someone wanted him gone badly enough to destroy his only means of transportation. He walked back into town, the 3 miles feeling longer with each step. His boots had seen better days, and by the time he reached Main Street, he could feel a blister forming on his right heel. The few people he passed looked away quickly, as if making eye contact might somehow implicate them. Floyd's place was busier than it had been during his first visit. The lunch crowd, all 8 of them, fell silent when Dominic walked in. He took a seat at the counter, ignoring the stares. Floyd came over with a pot of coffee. "Rough morning?" "Someone slashed my tires. Left me a note telling me to leave town." Floyd poured the coffee without comment, but Dominic saw concern flicker across his face. "You reported to Virgil?" "Sheriff Tate already paid me a visit this morning. Somehow I don't think he'll be investigating my vandalism case with much enthusiasm." "Probably not," Floyd agreed quietly. He glanced back at the kitchen, then leaned forward. "There's someone you should talk to. Lydia Frost, retired schoolteacher, lives on Maple Street, 3rd house on the left. White house with blue shutters. She's got a memory like a steel trap, and she's not afraid to use it." "Why would she talk to me?" "Because she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for about 40 years. Floyd straightened as one of the other customers called for more coffee. "Tell her Floyd sent you." Dominic found the house easily enough, a tidy white cottage with blue shutters and a garden that clearly received more attention than most properties in Milldale. A woman in her 70s answered the door, her silver hair pulled back in a braid, her eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Frost?" "Floyd Grimsby sent me." "My name is Dominic Lawson, the man who bought St. Jerome's." It wasn't a question. "I've been wondering when you'd come knocking." "Come in, Mr. Lawson. I'll make us some tea." Her living room was filled with books and photographs, decades of memories preserved and displayed. She brought out tea in delicate china cups that seemed at odds with the blunt directness in her eyes. "You've been asking questions," she said, settling into an armchair.
About the cemetery.
"About 1918. How did you—" "Small town, Mr. Lawson. Everyone knows everything or thinks they do." She sipped her tea. "What exactly did you find?" Dominic told her about the empty graves, the journal in the vault, Father Matthias's cryptic entries about missing people and buried truth. Lydia listened without interruption, her expression growing more somber. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and went to a bookshelf, pulling down a leather photo album. "My grandmother, Ruth Barton, lived through the 1918 epidemic. She was 16 years old. Lydia opened the album to a photograph of a young woman with sad eyes. "She told me stories, things that never made it into the official records, things people wanted to forget." "What kind of things?" "The Spanish flu hit Milldale hard and fast. People were dying in their homes, in the streets. The town leaders panicked. They set up a quarantine site at St. Jerome's Church, forced everyone who showed symptoms to go there, whether they wanted to or not." Dominic thought of Father Matthias's journal. "The references to quarantine care. My grandmother said it was like a prison," Lydia continued. "Families were torn apart. The sick were locked inside, given minimal food and water, left to either recover or die. Father Cornelius Ashford was supposed to minister to them, but Gran said he was more jailer than priest. The newspaper made him sound like a hero." Lydia's smile was bitter. "Newspapers print what they're told to print, especially in small towns where the editor's job depends on staying in the good graces of the mayor. The official story was that Father Cornelius tended to his flock selflessly. The truth was, he stood by while the town leaders made decisions no one should have to make." "What kind of decisions?" "The epidemic lasted 3 weeks. When it was over, 47 people had died. But Gran remembered 52 people being taken into the church. She counted them herself. She lived across the street, watched them being brought in one by one." Dominic's pulse quickened. "That matches what Father Matthias wrote." "He found the same discrepancy. 5 people," Lydia said softly. 5 souls who went into that church and never came out, but also never appeared in the death records. My grandmother asked about them afterward, about Annalise Cordell and her baby girl, about Samuel Winters, about the others. She was told they'd recovered and moved away, but Gran didn't believe it. She said Annalise would never have left without saying goodbye. "Annalise Cordell," Dominic repeated. Something about the name resonated, though he couldn't say why. Lydia pulled out another photograph from the album, a young woman with kind eyes, holding an infant. Annalise Cordell, age 24. Her daughter was named Grace. She was 2 years old when the epidemic came. She paused. Gran said that after the quarantine ended, she saw men digging behind the church one night. Not in the cemetery, but beyond it. When she asked about it, she was told to mind her business. How many men? She couldn't say for sure. It was dark, and she was watching from a window. But she counted at least 4 or 5 of them. Dominic thought about the empty graves he'd found. "Mrs. Frost, do you know anything about a priest named Father Matthias Grayson?" "I knew him when I was a girl. He was at St. Jerome's in the 50s. Kind man, but troubled. He left suddenly one year, and no one really talked about why." She looked at Dominic intently. "Did his journal tell you what he discovered?" "Not exactly. He wrote that the truth was buried, that someone needed to look beneath, but he never said what specifically happened to those 5 missing people." Lydia closed the album carefully. "Mr. Lawson, my grandmother spent the last years of her life believing something terrible happened in 1918, something the town covered up. She died thinking no one would ever know the truth. I've waited 40 years for someone to care enough to dig deeper. Why didn't you investigate yourself?" "I tried, but I'm not an outsider. I have family here, a reputation, connections. Asking too many questions would have cost me dearly." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have those constraints. You're already an outsider. They've already made that clear with your tires and your threatening note. You know about that?" "I know this town. I know how it protects its secrets." She stood and walked to a drawer, pulling out an envelope. "These are copies of letters my grandmother kept. Letters from Annalise Cordell to her sister, written during the quarantine. Gran found them after Annalise disappeared, read them. Then decide if you want to keep digging. Dominic took the envelope, feeling its weight. Why are you helping me? Because truth matters, Mr. Lawson. Because those 5 people deserve to be remembered. And because, she hesitated, because I think my grandmother was right. I think something unspeakable happened here. And the people responsible built this entire town's identity on top of that lie. Back at the church, as evening shadows lengthened, Dominic sat in the vault and read Annalise's letters by flashlight. Her handwriting was delicate, shaky in places, the words of a frightened young mother watching her daughter grow sicker by the day. The final letter was dated October 30th, 1918. Dearest Margaret, if you receive this, know that I tried. Grace is burning with fever. We have no medicine, no doctor. Father Cornelius says we must trust in God's plan, but I see no plan in this suffering. They have locked the doors from the outside. We cannot leave, cannot even bury our dead properly. The smell is unbearable. People are dying in the pews where they once prayed. I fear we will all die here, forgotten and alone. If I do not survive, please remember Grace. Remember she was loved. Remember she was here. Your sister, Annalise. Dominic's hands shook as he set down the letter. Annalise and Grace, real people with real lives, reduced to a discrepancy in an old ledger. His phone buzzed, a text from Jocelyn. Are you okay? You scared me yesterday, he typed back. I'm okay. Found some things. Important things. Can I call you? Her response came immediately. Yes. He climbed out of the vault and stepped outside where the signal was better. She answered on the first ring. Dad, I'm here, sweetheart. And I think I know why someone wants me gone from this place. Dominic told Jocelyn everything. The journal, Lydia's stories, Annalise's letters. He heard her breathing change on the other end of the line, the way it always did when she was processing something troubling. Dad, this sounds like it could be dangerous. 5 missing people, a town covering something up for over a century. I know how it sounds. Do you? Her voice sharpened with worry. Someone already slashed your tires. What's next? I have to see this through, Joss. These people, Annalise and her baby, they deserve better than being erased from history. Silence stretched between them. Then quietly, you sound like yourself again. Like the dad I remember. The words hit him harder than he expected. I'm trying to be. I could come out there, she said. Help you look through records, take notes. I still remember some of my journalism training. Jocelyn, I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. Her voice was firm. Besides, I took a few days off work. And I'd like to see this church you bought for $50. After they hung up, Dominic felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not just for solving the mystery, but for the possibility that he and his daughter might actually find their way back to each other. She arrived the next morning, driving a beat-up Honda that had seen better days. When she stepped out, Dominic was struck by how much she looked like Cora. Same dark hair, same determined set to her jaw. She was thinner than he remembered, wearing jeans and a jacket that had been Cora's. They stood awkwardly for a moment, before Jocelyn closed the distance and hugged him. Not a long embrace, but enough. The church is bigger than I expected, she said, pulling back and looking at the building. It's a mess, but it's got good bones. He led her inside, showed her the nave, the vault, the evidence he'd been collecting. She listened intently, asked sharp questions, and took notes on her phone. We need to see official records, she said. Death certificates, burial permits. If there really are 5 missing people, there should be a paper trail. They drove to the county records office in her car. Mrs. Pemberton's expression soured the moment she saw them together. Mrs. Pemberton, Jocelyn said with professional courtesy, we'd like to access death certificates and burial permits from October through November 1918. Those records are old. They may not be readily available, but they exist, Jocelyn pressed. In the archives. It would take time to retrieve them. We can wait. Mrs. Pemberton's jaw tightened, but she disappeared into a back room. 40 minutes later, she returned with a single file box. These are the death certificates from that period. Burial permits are filed separately. Dominic and Jocelyn spread the certificates across a table in the small research room. There were 47 total, dated between October 15th and November 7th, 1918. Each listed Spanish influenza as the cause of death. Each had been signed by Dr. Harold Winslow, the town physician. No Annalise Cordell, Jocelyn murmured, scanning through them. No Grace Cordell. Dominic checked against the list of names Lydia had provided. 3 others were also missing. Samuel Winters, age 62. Patricia Donovan, age 37. Bernard Keane, age 49. 5 people unaccounted for, Jocelyn said, photographing each certificate with her phone. Now we need the church records. Back at St. Jerome's, they descended into the vault together. The ledger from 1918 was on a shelf marked Quarantine Records. Dominic opened it carefully while Jocelyn held the flashlight. The entries were methodical, dated October 14th through November 2nd. Each page listed names, ages, dates of admission to the quarantine. Dominic counted them aloud. 47, 48, 49. His finger stopped on the 50th name. Annalise Cordell, age 24. Admitted October 16th. Next entry, Grace Cordell, age 2. Admitted October 16th. They continued. Samuel Winters. Patricia Donovan, Bernard Keane. 52 total admissions. But at the bottom of the page, a note in different handwriting, shakier, more urgent. November 2nd, 1918. Quarantine ended. 47 deaths recorded. 5 survivors transported per council directive. Father C.A. Transported where? Jocelyn asked. That's what Father Matthias was trying to find out. Dominic photographed the page. And look at this. The next several pages have been torn out. Indeed, jagged edges showed where someone had ripped entire sheets from the ledger. Whatever had happened after November 2nd, someone had wanted it erased. We need burial permits, Jocelyn said. If these people died, even if it wasn't from the flu, there should be permits. They returned to the county office the next day. Mrs. Pemberton was even less cooperative, claiming the burial permits from 1918 had been damaged in a basement flood 20 years ago. All of them? Jocelyn asked skeptically. Most of them. What survived is incomplete. Can we see what's there? With obvious reluctance, Mrs. Pemberton produced a thin folder. Inside were burial permits for 38 of the 47 deceased. 9 were missing, including the 5 people they were looking for. Convenient, Jocelyn muttered as they left. That evening, they sat in the church, going through everything they'd gathered. Dominic had found a small camping lantern that cast shadows on the walls as they worked. There's a pattern here, Jocelyn said, arranging photos on her phone. The 5 missing people, they're not just absent from death records. They're absent from everything after November 2nd. No burial permits, no obituaries, nothing. Lydia said her grandmother saw men digging behind the church that night. Then that's where we need to look. Jocelyn stood, grabbed a flashlight. Come on, now. It's almost dark. Better than broad daylight where everyone can see what we're doing. They went to the cemetery, moving past the marked graves to the area beyond the fence. The ground here was rougher, overgrown with scrub brush and young trees. Jocelyn swept her flashlight back and forth while Dominic followed. Here, she said, stopping. Look at this. A depression in the earth, roughly rectangular, mostly filled in but still visible, about 6 feet long. Then another a few yards away, and another. 5 depressions total, arranged in an irregular line. These aren't the empty graves I found in the cemetery, Dominic said quietly. These are older. Decades old. Jocelyn crouched down, touching the ground. If bodies were buried here in 1918, and this area was never officially part of the cemetery, they'd be unmarked, forgotten. They stood in silence, the weight of it settling over them. 5 people, murdered or left to die, buried in secret ground, and erased from history. We need proof, Jocelyn said finally. We need something concrete before we can accuse anyone of anything. Back in the vault, Dominic searched more carefully through the boxes. He found old financial records, correspondence, years of accumulated church business. Then in a box marked Personal Effects, Father C.A., he found a small leather pouch. Inside was a key, tarnished brass, about 3 inches long. A paper tag attached to it read, Mine Gate, Eastern Ridge, "What mine?" Jocelyn asked. Dominic thought back to his conversations in town. Floyd had mentioned old mining operations, abandoned when the ore ran out in the 1890s. There were tunnels all through the hills around Milldale. He dug deeper in the box and found a letter, folded and sealed with wax that had long since cracked. The envelope was addressed simply, "To whom it may find." With trembling hands, Dominic broke the seal and pulled out the letter. The handwriting was elegant, but showed signs of stress, pressed too hard in places, trailing off in others. "November 5th, 1918, he read aloud. "To whoever finds this testimony, may God grant you the courage I lacked. I am Father Cornelius Ashford, priest of St. Jerome's Church, and I am a coward." Jocelyn moved closer, reading over his shoulder. "The influenza took 47 of my parishioners. I prayed with them, gave them last rites, watched them suffer and die. When it was over, 5 remained, weak, sick but alive. The town council met in emergency session. Mayor Garrett argued that letting these 5 people back into the community risked reigniting the epidemic. He said we had to take measures to ensure the town's survival." Dominic's voice caught. He cleared his throat and continued. "I objected, I argued. But I was outvoted, and I was threatened. They said if I spoke against them, my sister and her children would suffer for it. So I stayed silent while they took those 5 people, good people, people I had sworn to protect, and sealed them in the old mine shaft on Eastern Ridge. I heard them calling out. I heard them for 3 days before the voices stopped." The letter trembled in Dominic's hands. "I have hidden this confession and a vial of blood from one of the victims as evidence of what was done. The key to the mine is enclosed. May God forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself. I flee this place a broken man. Father Cornelius Ashford." Silence filled the vault. Then Jocelyn spoke, her voice tight with anger. "They buried 5 people alive. Neither of them slept that night. They sat in the church nave, the confession letter between them, wrestling with the horror of what they'd uncovered. 5 people, including a 2-year-old child, sealed in a mine shaft and left to die. Not killed by disease, but by fear and cruelty dressed up as civic duty. We have to find that mine," Jocelyn said, as the first light of dawn crept through the broken windows. "We have to confirm it. And then what? Go to the sheriff, who's already made it clear he wants me gone. Take it to Mrs. Pemberton, whose family probably helped cover this up. Then we go public. I still have contacts from journalism school, people who work at papers in the state capitol. This is the kind of story that doesn't stay buried once it gets out." Dominic looked at his daughter, seeing the fire in her eyes that reminded him so much of Cora. "You understand what you're saying? We accuse prominent families in this town of covering up mass murder, because that's what it was, and we make enemies we can't undo. Dad, they murdered a baby. They let a 2-year-old girl die in the dark, calling for her mother. I don't care who gets angry." He felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly choked him. This was the daughter he'd raised, the one who believed in justice, in truth, in doing what was right, even when it was hard. He'd lost sight of that girl in his grief, but she'd never really gone away. "Okay," he said. "We find the mine. We document everything. Then we make sure the world knows." They spent the morning searching the vault more thoroughly. Jocelyn had the idea that if Father Cornelius had hidden the confession and the key, he might have hidden other evidence too. She was the one who noticed the irregularity in the stone wall, a section that sounded hollow when she tapped it. Together, they carefully worked at the mortar with an old screwdriver until they could pry loose several stones. Behind them was a small cavity deliberately constructed. Inside sat 3 items: a sealed glass vial containing dark liquid, another envelope, and a small iron key with a tag reading "Mine Gate, Eastern Ridge." The vial's label, written in faded ink, made Dominic's stomach turn. "Blood of the innocent, Nov, 1918. May God forgive us." "He kept evidence," Jocelyn breathed. "Physical evidence." The second letter was shorter, dated November 4th, 1918, and written in the same hand as the confession. "Should anyone doubt the testimony I leave behind, let this vial serve as proof. This blood was drawn from Annalise Cordell before she was taken to the mine." I took it under the pretense of checking for fever, but in truth, I hoped to have evidence of her existence, her humanity. She was alive when they sealed that shaft. They all were. This blood is on all our hands, but most heavily on mine, for my silence. The key to the mine is enclosed. May a braver soul than I use it to bring these victims home. C.A. Dominic photographed everything, while Jocelyn took notes. They were building a case, piece by piece, testimony, evidence, documentation. Around noon, they heard a truck pull up outside. Dominic tensed, but relaxed when he recognized Floyd climbing out carrying a paper bag. "Figured you two might be hungry," Floyd said, handing over sandwiches and coffee. "Whole town's talking about you going through county records. Thought I'd check in." They invited him into the church and showed him what they'd found, everything except the vial which Dominic had carefully wrapped and hidden. Some evidence was too important to show anyone yet. Floyd read Father Cornelius's confession with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. "My great-grandmother," he said hoarsely. "Patricia Donovan. She was 47 years old. She made quilts. She sang in the choir, and they buried her alive in a mine shaft. We're going to find that mine," Jocelyn said gently. "We're going to bring them home." Floyd wiped his eyes. "I'll help you. I know these hills. I've hunted them since I was a boy. Eastern Ridge has 3 old mine entrances that I know of. We can check them all. Floyd, if you help us, people in this town will turn on you too. Let them. I've lived with this weight my whole life, knowing something was wrong, knowing the story didn't add up, but being too scared to push. I'm done being scared." They agreed to search the next day. Floyd would bring supplies, rope, better flashlights, tools for breaking through any barriers they might find. Dominic would have preferred to go immediately, but Floyd was right that they needed to be prepared. That evening, while Jocelyn was outside getting better phone signal to call her contacts in journalism, Dominic heard a vehicle approach. This time it was Sheriff Virgil Tate's cruiser. Virgil stepped out slowly, his expression harder than it had been before. "Mr. Lawson, we need to talk." "About what?" "About you stirring up trouble. About you breaking into sealed county archives." "We didn't break into anything. We requested public records." "About you trespassing on private property." Virgil's hand rested on his belt, near his weapon. "The old mine shafts on Eastern Ridge are on private land, property of the Garrett family. You go up there, you're trespassing." "Interesting," Dominic said carefully. "How did you know we were interested in the mines?" Virgil's jaw tightened. "Small town. Word travels. Or Mrs. Pemberton called you the moment we mentioned Eastern Ridge." Dominic stepped closer. "What are you so afraid we'll find up there, Sheriff?" "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm trying to prevent trouble. Those mines are dangerous, unstable tunnels, cave-in risks. People have died in them. People died in them in 1918 too. 5 people. Sealed inside and left to die." The words hung in the air between them. Virgil's face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Your great-grandfather was on the town council that made the decision. That's why you're here, not to protect me from danger, but to protect your family's reputation. You're making serious accusations without proof. We have proof. Father Cornelius's confession. Church records showing 5 people who entered quarantine and never officially came out. County records that mysteriously have no death certificates or burial permits for those 5 people. Virgil took a step back, his face flushed. "Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is, you're talking about events from over a century ago. Everyone involved is long dead. What good does it do to drag their names through the mud now?" "What good?" Jocelyn's voice came from behind him. She'd returned without either of them noticing. "How about justice? How about making sure Annalise Cordell and her daughter Grace are remembered as real people who lived and died, not as numbers in a ledger that don't add up? Miss, you don't understand what you're messing with. This town has important families, people with resources and influence. Are you threatening us, Sheriff?" Jocelyn had her phone out recording. "Because that sounds a lot like a threat." Virgil's face darkened. "I'm warning you. For your own good. There are people in this town who won't take kindly to you destroying reputations based on ancient history. Then those people have something to hide," Dominic said quietly. and we're going to find out what. After Virgil left, tires spitting gravel, Jocelyn showed Dominic her phone. Got all of that recorded. If anything happens to us, nothing's going to happen, Dominic said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. But that night, lying in his sleeping bag in the church, he heard them again. Footsteps in the cemetery, voices low and urgent. He looked out to see multiple figures moving through the darkness with flashlights, examining the ground where he and Jocelyn had found the depressions. They were checking the secret graves, making sure nothing had been disturbed. Dominic watched until they left, his heart pounding. Tomorrow they would go to the mine. Tomorrow they would find the truth that had been buried for 107 years. And tomorrow, he suspected, would be when things got truly dangerous. The morning came too quickly. Dominic had barely slept, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. When Jocelyn emerged from the small room she'd claimed as her own, what had once been the priest's office, she looked just as tired. "I kept thinking about Grace," she said quietly over instant coffee. 2 years old. The same age as... She stopped. Dominic knew what she'd been about to say. The same age as the daughter Jocelyn and Cora had talked about having someday, back when the future seemed full of possibilities instead of losses. Floyd arrived at 8 with supplies packed in his truck. Rope, industrial flashlights, a first aid kit, bottles of water, and a crowbar. "The mine entrance I'm thinking of is about 5 miles east, up a logging road. It's the only one with an iron gate. The others collapsed decades ago." They drove in Floyd's truck, Dominic in the passenger seat, Jocelyn in the back taking notes and photographs of everything. The logging road was barely a road at all anymore. 2 ruts through scrub brush and pine trees, winding upward into the hills. Eastern Ridge loomed above them, its rocky face scarred by old mining operations. They passed rusted equipment, collapsed structures, the bones of an industry that had died long before Dominic was born. "There!" Floyd said, pointing. The mine entrance was a dark mouth in the hillside, reinforced with timber that had somehow survived the decades. An iron gate blocked the opening, secured with a heavy padlock green with age. Dominic pulled out the brass key. His hands shook slightly as he fitted it into the lock. For a moment he thought it wouldn't work. Too much rust, too many years. Then something clicked. The lock opened. The gate swung inward with a shriek of metal that echoed into the darkness beyond. Cold air breathed out from the tunnel, carrying the smell of damp earth and stone and something else, something old and still. "Last chance to turn back," Floyd said, though his voice made it clear he had no intention of turning back himself. Jocelyn switched on her flashlight. "Let's go." They entered single file, Floyd leading, then Jocelyn, then Dominic. The tunnel was narrow, reinforced with timber beams that groaned under the weight of the mountain above. Their footsteps echoed strangely, and water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead. "The main shaft goes down about 200 yards, Floyd said, his voice hushed. "Then it branches. We're looking for signs of deliberate sealing, piled rocks, timbers, anything that looks like it was meant to block passage." They walked in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the scuff of boots on stone. The temperature dropped the deeper they went, and Dominic's breath came out in visible puffs. After what felt like an eternity but was probably 10 minutes, Floyd stopped. There, his flashlight illuminated a wall of stones and broken timber that completely blocked the tunnel. Unlike the natural rock around it, this was clearly man-made, rocks piled deliberately, gaps filled with smaller stones and dirt. "This wasn't a cave-in," Jocelyn said, running her hand along the barrier. "This was built." They began removing stones, working carefully. The rocks had settled over the decades, packed tight by time and the weight pressing down. Dominic's back ached, his hands scraped and bleeding, but he kept working. Behind this wall was the truth. Behind this wall was Annalise. After an hour, they'd created an opening large enough to crawl through. Floyd went first, his flashlight beam disappearing into the space beyond. "Oh God," they heard him say. Dominic and Jocelyn scrambled through after him and froze. The chamber beyond was maybe 20 feet across, with a ceiling barely high enough to stand. And scattered across the stone floor were the remains, skeletal, some still wearing scraps of clothing, their bones arranged in positions that told stories of final moments. Someone huddled against the wall, someone curled in a fetal position, someone with their arms wrapped around something smaller. Jocelyn made a sound, half sob, half gasp, and turned away, her hand over her mouth. Dominic approached the figure with the smaller skeleton slowly, reverently. A woman's skeleton, judging by the size and the remnants of a dress that had somehow survived. In her arms, or what had been her arms, the tiny bones of a child. Around the woman's neck, barely visible beneath the bones of her ribs, was a tarnished locket. With trembling hands, Dominic picked it up, brushing away dirt. The locket opened at his touch. Inside were 2 photographs, preserved by the sealed locket from the worst of time's decay. A young woman smiling, and a baby with Cora's eyes. No, not Cora's eyes, but the same shape, the same spacing, family resemblance reaching across generations. Annalise, he whispered, and Grace. The realization hit him like a physical blow, so hard he had to sit down on the cold stone floor. He pulled out his wallet with shaking hands and found the photograph he always carried. Cora on their wedding day. Radiant and beautiful. He held it next to the locket picture. The resemblance was undeniable. The same facial structure, the same smile. "Dad?" Jocelyn's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Dad, what is it?" "I need to show you something," he managed. "Back at the church. In my truck. There's a box, my grandmother's things." "Your grandmother?" "I never knew her well. She died when I was young. But my mother once told me," he struggled to remember, "that Grandma Pearl's mother had died young, that she'd been raised by an aunt. I never thought to ask more. But Pearl's mother—" The pieces were falling into place, connections he should have seen earlier but had been too close to recognize. "We need to get back to the church," he said, standing abruptly. "Right now." Floyd looked at the remains. "We can't just leave them. We're not leaving them. We're going to get authorities, proper forensic teams, people who can document everything correctly." Dominic was already backing toward the opening they'd made. "But first I need to check something. Something important. They took photographs, dozens of them, from every angle. Documented the positions of the remains, the state of the clothing, every detail they could capture. Jocelyn was thorough, her journalism training taking over even as tears streamed down her face. The drive back to town took half the time the drive out had, Dominic urging Floyd to go faster. At the church, he went straight to his truck and pulled out a storage box he'd retrieved weeks ago. A box he'd been meaning to go through but hadn't had the heart to face. His grandmother's things, old photographs, letters, a family Bible. He found what he was looking for buried near the bottom, a photograph of himself as a small boy, maybe 7 years old, standing in front of St. Jerome's Church. Next to him stood an elderly woman with kind eyes. Written on the back, in faded ink, "Dominic and Grandma Pearl, St. Jerome's, summer 1986. He opened the Bible to the family tree recorded on the inside cover. His hands shook so badly Jocelyn had to help him hold it steady. "Pearl Cordell Lawson," Jocelyn read aloud. "Born 1923, daughter of Margaret Cordell and—" She stopped, her eyes going wide. "Margaret Cordell, sister of Annalise Cordell." The silence in the church was absolute. "Annalise's sister Margaret survived," Dominic said, his voice breaking. "She had a daughter, Pearl. Pearl was my grandmother. Which means Annalise was your great-great-aunt," Jocelyn finished. "And Grace was your great-great-aunt too. Dad, this is your family. This whole time, you've been investigating your own family's murder." Dominic sat down heavily on a pew. The church he'd been drawn to, the mystery he'd been compelled to solve, it had never been random. Some part of him, some deep instinct had led him here, had brought him home to the family he'd never known he'd lost. "They were erased," he said quietly. "Annalise and Grace, they were erased from history. No one remembered them. No one mourned them. They died alone in the dark, and the world forgot they ever existed." Jocelyn knelt beside him, taking his hand. "But we remember them now. We know the truth, and we're going to make sure everyone else knows it too." Floyd, who'd been silent throughout this revelation, cleared his throat. You're not just an outsider asking questions anymore, Dominic. Your family demanding justice. That changes things. How? It means you have every right to see this through. It means when the people in this town try to shut you down, you can look them in the eye and say, they murdered my family. Floyd's expression was fierce. It means you're not going anywhere until this is finished. The revelation changed everything. What had been a stranger's quest for truth became deeply, painfully personal. Dominic spent that evening going through every document, every photograph, piecing together the family history that had been fractured by silence and shame. Margaret Cordell, Annalise's younger sister, had been 17 when the epidemic hit. She'd escaped quarantine because she'd been visiting relatives in another county when the outbreak began. By the time she returned, her sister and niece were gone, officially relocated according to town records, though Margaret had never believed it. The letters Lydia had given him took on new meaning now. They weren't just historical documents. They were messages from his great-great-aunt, written in the final days of her life, personal, family. "We need a strategy," Jocelyn said, pulling him back to the present. She had her laptop open, notes spread across the desk. "We have evidence, but we need to present it in a way that can't be ignored or dismissed. What are you thinking? We document everything first. High-resolution photos of the mine, the remains, every piece of evidence from the vault. We scan all the documents. Then we contact multiple outlets simultaneously. Newspapers, TV stations, online journalists. Make it impossible to suppress," Floyd nodded. "And we need to reach out to other families. I'm not the only descendant of the victims in this area. There's a woman over in Polk County, Linda Weathers. Her great-grandfather was Samuel Winters. There are others too, scattered around. If we can get them together, show them what we found—" "Strength in numbers," Dominic said. "Exactly. And witnesses. The more people who know what we've uncovered, the harder it'll be for anyone to bury it again." They worked through the night, creating a comprehensive file of evidence. Jocelyn's journalism background proved invaluable. She knew how to organize information, how to build a narrative that was both factual and compelling. By morning, they had a plan. Floyd would reach out to other descendants. Jocelyn would contact journalists she trusted. And Dominic would prepare a formal statement for the authorities. Not Sheriff Tate, but the state police and the Attorney General's office. "Once we make this public, there's no taking it back," Jocelyn warned. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Dominic looked at the photograph of Annalise and Grace, at the locket he now wore around his own neck. "I've been ready since the moment I found those empty graves. I just didn't know how ready until now." They drove to the nearest city 3 hours away, where Jocelyn had arranged to meet Oscar Fry, an investigative journalist she'd interned with during college. Oscar was in his 50s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much corruption and not enough justice. He listened to their story in a coffee shop, examining each piece of evidence they showed him on Jocelyn's laptop. The photographs from the mine made him set down his cup, his expression hardening. He stopped, searching for words. "This is one of the most significant cover-ups I've encountered in 30 years of journalism. Mass murder, falsified records, a conspiracy that's lasted over a century. Will you publish it?" Dominic asked. "I'll do better than publish it. I'll make sure every major outlet in the state picks it up. I'll contact the Attorney General personally. I covered his campaign. He trusts me. This won't stay buried, Mr. Lawson. I promise you that." While Oscar made calls, they drove to the state police headquarters. The detective who met with them, a woman named Sandra Preston, listened with increasing concern as they laid out their evidence. "We'll need to secure that mine site immediately," she said, already reaching for her phone. "And we'll need forensic anthropologists, a full investigation team. Mr. Lawson, this is going to become a major criminal investigation. Even though the perpetrators are long dead, I understand. You may need to testify, provide documentation, possibly face hostile questioning from people who don't want this truth exposed. I'm prepared for that." Detective Preston studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because what you've uncovered, this matters. These victims deserve justice, even if it's 100 years late. By evening, the first news stories started appearing online. Oscar had worked fast, and other journalists hungry for the story had picked it up. The headlines were stark: mass murder cover-up in Milldale, 1918. Epidemic victims found in sealed mine. Century-old secret exposed. Town leaders buried 5 people alive. Dominic's phone rang. It was Lydia Frost. "I just saw the news," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandmother would have been so grateful." "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Thank you for having the courage she always wished someone would have." More calls came in. Floyd reported that he'd reached 4 other descendant families, all shocked and eager to know more. Linda Weathers, Samuel Winter's great-granddaughter, was driving up from Polk County the next day. But not all the reactions were positive. Sheriff Tate left a voicemail, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What you've done, stirring up all this trouble, these accusations, you'll regret this, Lawson. This town will make you regret this." Mrs. Pemberton's message was colder. "You've destroyed good people's reputations based on ancient history. I hope you can live with yourself." And there were others, anonymous calls, some threatening, some simply angry. People who saw what Dominic had done not as justice, but as betrayal, as an outsider tearing down their community's carefully constructed history. That night, they returned to Milldale to find a crowd gathered outside St. Jerome's Church. Maybe 30 people, some holding signs. "Leave our history alone. Outsider, go home. The past is the past." But there were others, too. Floyd stood near the church steps with 6 people. Descendants of the victims, supporters who believed in the truth. They'd formed a protective line, a buffer between the hostile crowd and the church. Dominic got out of the car slowly, Jocelyn beside him. The angry voices grew louder. Then a woman pushed through the crowd, elderly, leaning on a cane, but with fire in her eyes. She walked right up to Dominic. "I'm Linda Weathers," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Samuel Winters was my great-grandfather. For 80 years, my family was told he died of the flu and was buried somewhere unknown. Now I know the truth. He was murdered, sealed in a mine and left to die." She turned to face the crowd. "If you're angry about that truth coming out, then you're angry at the wrong person. Be angry at the people who did it. Be angry at the cover-up. Don't be angry at the man who finally gave my family answers." The crowd grew quieter. Some people left, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others stayed, but looked less certain. Virgil Tate pulled up in his cruiser, got out slowly. For a moment, Dominic thought he was going to arrest someone. Instead, the sheriff just looked tired. "State police are taking over the investigation," Virgil said quietly. "I've been asked to cooperate fully." He paused. "My great-grandfather made a terrible choice. That's on him, not on me. But I'm sorry I tried to protect his memory instead of doing what was right. It wasn't much, but it was something." The state police arrived at dawn, a convoy of vehicles that transformed the quiet hillside into a crime scene. Detective Preston coordinated the operation with quiet efficiency. Forensic teams, evidence technicians, photographers, all moving with purpose into the mine. Dominic stood at a distance with Jocelyn and Floyd, watching as professionals did what he'd known needed to be done. They'd been asked to stay back, to let the experts work. But Preston had promised they could observe. "It's real now," Jocelyn said softly. "All of it." Linda Weathers had joined them, along with 3 other descendants who'd arrived overnight. They stood together in silence, a vigil for family members they'd never known but were finally learning to grieve. By midday, the forensic team emerged with their preliminary findings. Preston came to brief them personally. 5 sets of remains, consistent with what you reported. Based on the condition of the clothing and artifacts found with them, we can confirm they're from the early 20th century. We'll do DNA testing to establish identities, but given the documentation you've provided, I don't think there's much doubt. How long will the investigation take?" Dominic asked. "Weeks, possibly months. We need to exhume and examine everything properly, review all historical records, build a complete picture." She paused. "But Mr. Lawson, you should know. What you've uncovered is already having an impact. The Attorney General is considering whether to issue a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, possibly some form of posthumous exoneration or memorial. That would mean a lot, Linda said quietly. Back in Milldale, the town was fracturing. Some families, the descendants of the 1918 council members, were defensive, angry, circling wagons. Others, like Floyd and a growing number of long-time residents, were grappling with the truth, trying to understand how their town had been built on such a dark foundation. Mrs. Pemberton resigned from her position at the county office. She released a statement through her attorney, a brief apology for obstructing the investigation and an acknowledgement that her family had known about the cover-up for generations. It wasn't enough for everyone, but it was something. The church became a gathering place. Dominic hadn't planned it that way, but people started showing up. Descendants of victims, historians, journalists, and ordinary citizens who wanted to understand what had happened. Jocelyn suggested they create a temporary memorial. They cleared the nave, set up a table with photographs of the 5 victims that Floyd and the other descendants had managed to gather. Annalise and Grace, Samuel Winters, Patricia Donovan, Bernard Keane, no longer just names on a list, but real people with faces and stories. Dominic placed the locket beside Annalise's photograph. Beside it, he put the letter she'd written to her sister Margaret, the one that had never been sent. People came to stand before the memorial in silence. Some cried, some just looked, bearing witness. One evening, as Dominic was straightening the photographs, a man in his 70s approached. He had the weathered face of someone who'd worked outdoors his whole life. "Mr. Lawson, my name is Burton Reeves. My great-grandfather was on the town council in 1918. Dominic tensed, waiting for anger or accusations. "I just wanted to say," Burton's voice cracked, "I wanted to say I'm sorry for what he did. For what my family helped hide." He looked at the photographs. "That little girl, Grace, she was younger than my own granddaughter. I can't imagine." He couldn't finish. Dominic put a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your burden to carry," Dominic said quietly. "What they did, that's on them. What you do now, how you choose to acknowledge the truth, that's on you." Burton nodded, wiping his eyes. "There's going to be a town council meeting tomorrow night to discuss a memorial, maybe renaming the park after the victims. I'm going to speak in favor of it. And I'm going to make sure people know my great-grandfather was wrong. What they did was murder, no matter how they justified it." After he left, Jocelyn came to stand beside Dominic. "People are changing their minds. Slowly, but it's happening. Not everyone. No, not everyone. But enough. Enough that this town might actually heal instead of just hiding." That night, while Jocelyn slept, Dominic sat in the church alone with his thoughts. He wore the locket now, Annalise's locket, feeling the weight of it against his chest. Family he'd never known he had, reaching across a century of silence to pull him here. He thought about Cora, about how grief had broken him so completely. But somewhere in that breaking, in that descent to rock bottom, sleeping in his truck, he'd been led here, to this church, to this mystery, to this truth that needed finding. Maybe that's what redemption looked like. Not a straight path back to who you were, but a winding road to becoming someone new. Someone who could honor the dead by refusing to let them be forgotten. He pulled out paper and pen, old habits from the letters he'd tried to write to Jocelyn, and began writing. Not to Jocelyn this time, but to Annalise. A letter to a woman dead for over a century, but who felt more present than ever. "Dear Annalise, I'm your sister's great-grandson. I never knew you existed until a few weeks ago, but I feel like I've known you my whole life. I found you. I found Grace. And I promise both of you the world will remember. Your names won't be erased anymore. Your story will be told. You mattered. You lived. You loved your daughter. And that will never be forgotten again." He folded the letter and placed it on the memorial table beside her photograph. Outside, he heard a vehicle approach. For a moment, old wariness returned. Was it another threat, another attempt to stop him? But it was just Detective Preston's unmarked car. She got out, saw the light in the church, and came to the door. "Mr. Lawson, thought you should know. We've completed the preliminary DNA analysis. We used genealogical databases compared against your DNA sample and the other descendants. Dominic's heart rate picked up. And? Confirmed. The woman and child found together, they're Annalise Cordell and Grace Cordell. And based on the DNA match, they're definitely your family. Preston's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss, even though it happened long before you were born. After she left, Dominic sat in the silence of the church and let himself finally feel it all. Grief for family he'd never known. Rage at their murders and something else. Something that felt almost like peace. He'd come here broken, seeking nothing more than a roof over his head. Instead, he'd found purpose. He'd found his daughter again, and he'd found the family history that had shaped his life without him ever knowing it. The town council meeting drew a crowd larger than Milldale had seen in decades. The high school gymnasium, borrowed for the occasion, was packed. Descendants of victims, descendants of perpetrators, journalists, curious onlookers, and state officials observing the proceedings. Dominic sat in the front row with Jocelyn on one side and Linda Weathers on the other. Floyd had saved seats for the other victim families. They formed a united front, quiet but determined. The council president, a younger man named Philip Crane, who'd only been elected the previous year, opened the meeting with visible nervousness. We're here tonight to discuss the recent discoveries at St. Jerome's Church and the Eastern Ridge mine site. The state investigation is ongoing, but we as a community need to decide how we respond, how we acknowledge what happened, and how we move forward. Burton Reeves was the first to speak. Standing at the microphone, he looked every one of his 73 years, but his voice was steady. My great-grandfather, Wesley Reeves, was on the town council in 1918. He participated in the decision to seal 5 people in that mine. For 107 years, my family kept that secret. We were complicit in erasing 5 innocent people from history. He paused, gathering himself. I stand here tonight to say what my great-grandfather should have said then. We were wrong. What they did was murder, and this town needs to acknowledge that truth and honor the victims. The gymnasium erupted in a mix of applause and angry muttering. Others spoke, some defending their ancestors' impossible choices in desperate times, others condemning the cover-up that had lasted generations. One woman shouted that Dominic was destroying the town's reputation for his own glory. A man countered that the town's reputation deserved to be destroyed if it was built on lies. When Dominic's turn came, he approached the microphone with his heart hammering. Public speaking had never been his strength, but this mattered too much to stay silent. My name is Dominic Lawson. Most of you know by now that I bought St. Jerome's Church a few weeks ago. What you might not know is that I'm Annalise Cordell's great-great-nephew. When I came here, I was homeless, broke, and barely holding on. I bought that church for $50 because it was all I had left. He saw some faces soften, others harden. I didn't come here looking for a mystery or seeking to hurt anyone. I came looking for a second chance. What I found was the truth about my own family I never knew existed. Annalise was 24 years old. Her daughter Grace was 2. They survived the Spanish flu, and they were murdered for it. His voice broke slightly. He felt Jocelyn's presence behind him, giving him strength. I don't want revenge. The people who did this are long dead. What I want, what all of us want, he gestured to the other descendants, is acknowledgement. Recognition that these 5 people lived, that they mattered, that what happened to them was wrong. We want a memorial. We want their names restored to history. That's all. Linda Weathers spoke next, her voice trembling but fierce. My great-grandfather Samuel Winters was a carpenter. He built half the houses in this town. He survived the flu, and his reward was to die in the dark, sealed in a mine shaft. Don't tell me that's ancient history. Don't tell me to let it go. He deserves to be remembered. The debate went on for 2 hours. Heated at times, emotional throughout. But gradually a consensus emerged. The council would commission a memorial at St. Jerome's Church. The 5 victims' names would be added to the town's memorial plaque. A historical marker would be placed at the mine site, and the town would issue a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It wasn't perfect. Some council members abstained rather than vote yes. Some families walked out in protest. But it passed. Outside afterward, Dominic felt exhausted but lighter somehow. Jocelyn hugged him tightly. "You did it, Dad. You actually did it." "We did it," he corrected. "All of us." Detective Preston approached with an update. "The forensic team has completed their work at the mine. The remains will be released for proper burial within the next few weeks. You'll be able to arrange a funeral service." "A funeral," Dominic repeated. 107 years late, but finally a chance to lay them to rest properly. Over the following days, plans took shape. The descendants worked together to arrange a memorial service. St. Jerome's Church would host it, fitting since that's where it had all begun. Dominic threw himself into preparing the church. He'd been doing basic repairs since he arrived, but now he worked with purpose, restoring what he could. Lloyd brought friends to help. Local contractors, moved by the story, donated materials and labor. The church slowly transformed. Windows were replaced. Walls were repaired and painted. The old pews were refinished. It would never be what it once was, but it became something new, a place of remembrance, of truth-telling, of healing. Jocelyn stayed through it all, working beside him. One evening, as they painted the nave walls, she spoke quietly. "Mom would be proud of you." Dominic's hand stilled on the brush. "You think so?" "I know so." "She always said you had a good heart, even when you couldn't see it yourself. She'd be proud that you found your way back." "I had help." He looked at his daughter. "I couldn't have done this without you, Joss. You coming here helping me, it saved me." "You saved me." She set down her brush and hugged him, paint-stained hands and all. "We saved each other, Dad." That night, alone in the church, Dominic stood before the growing memorial. More photographs had been added. Images of the victims in life, smiling and whole. Documents had been framed and hung. Testimonies from descendants were displayed. He touched the locket at his neck, feeling its familiar weight. Tomorrow, the state would officially release the remains. Next week would be the funeral. And then he would figure out what came next. Maybe he'd stay in Milldale, turn the church into a permanent memorial and community center. Maybe he'd move on, his purpose here fulfilled. He didn't know yet, but for the first time in years, he had options. He had his daughter back. He had a reason to wake up each morning. He had peace with the past, even as he honored it. The wooden cross carved with Grace's name sat on the memorial table. He picked it up, running his thumb over the worn letters. A father's love carved into wood, surviving a century. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "Everyone knows your name now." 3 months had passed since that town council meeting. Summer had arrived in Milldale, bringing warmth and green growth to the hills that had witnessed so much suffering. The church stood transformed, still old, still weathered, but restored with care and purpose. Today was the day they'd all been waiting for. The cemetery behind St. Jerome's had been cleared and tended, the old headstones cleaned, the grass cut. And now 5 new graves had been dug in a place of honor at the center. Proper graves this time, with dignity and care. 5 polished headstones stood waiting, each bearing a name that had been erased for too long. Annalise Cordell, 1894-1918, beloved sister and Mother Grace Cordell. 1916-1918, forever loved Samuel Winters. 1856-1918, master carpenter Patricia Donovan. 1871-1918, voice of the choir Bernard Keane. 1869-1918, friend to all. The service began at 10 in the morning. Over 200 people gathered, far more than Dominic had expected. Descendants of the victims, yes, but also residents of Milldale who'd come to witness this moment of reckoning and remembrance. Journalists documented it all. State officials attended, lending their authority to the acknowledgement of truth. A local minister, Pastor Helen Cortez, led the service with quiet grace. She spoke of justice delayed but not denied, of the importance of truth, of the healing that comes from facing painful history rather than burying it. Lloyd spoke, sharing what he'd learned about his great-grandmother Patricia. She sang in this church every Sunday. Her voice could fill the whole building, they said. She survived the flu, and for that survival she was punished with death. But today we give her back her voice. Today we remember her song. Linda Weathers spoke about Samuel, the grandfather she'd never known but had come to understand through this journey. He built homes for families, gave them shelter. And when he needed shelter, when he needed compassion, he was given a tomb instead. But we give him peace now. We give him the rest he was denied. Burton Reeves stood and spoke on behalf of the descendants of the council members. My great-grandfather and the others made a choice born of fear and desperation. But that doesn't excuse what they did. Murder is murder, no matter the justification. To the families of the victims, I say again, I'm sorry. We're sorry. And we commit to ensuring this truth is never buried again. Then it was Dominic's turn. He'd written and rewritten his words a dozen times, but now, standing before the gathered crowd with Jocelyn beside him, he set aside his notes and spoke from his heart. I came to Milldale 6 months ago with nothing but $50 and a broken spirit. I'd lost my wife, my home, my sense of who I was. I bought this church not knowing that it held the secrets of my own family's tragedy. Annalise Cordell was my great-great-aunt. Grace was my family. He paused, looking at the headstones. But they're more than just my family. They're everyone's family now. They represent every person whose story has been erased, every victim whose suffering has been denied, every truth that powerful people tried to bury. Today we say no more. Today we remember. He pulled out the locket, opened it to show the photographs inside. This is Annalise holding her daughter, a mother protecting her child even in the darkest moments. When I wear this, I carry her with me. I carry all of them with me. And I hope everyone here will carry them too. Not as a burden, but as a reminder that truth matters, that every life matters, that we owe the dead our honesty and our remembrance. The caskets, simple but dignified, were lowered into the ground. People filed past, each leaving a flower, a stone, a token of remembrance. Jocelyn laid a bouquet on Grace's grave, tears streaming down her face. Dominic knelt beside Annalise's grave and placed the wooden cross there, the one carved with Grace's name. You're home now, he whispered. Both of you. You're home. After the service, people gathered at the church. It had been transformed into something new, part memorial, part community center, part museum. The vault below had been preserved as an educational space, with Father Matthias's journal and Father Cornelius's confession displayed behind protective glass. A bronze plaque had been mounted by the entrance, St. Jerome's Memorial Center, in memory of Annalise Cordell, Grace Cordell, Samuel Winters, Patricia Donovan, and Bernard Keane, victims of injustice, 1918. As may truth and remembrance prevent such darkness from ever returning. Dominic stood on the church steps, watching people move through the building, reading the displays, bearing witness. Lydia Frost approached, leaning on her cane. Your grandmother Pearl would be proud, she said. She spent her whole life wondering what happened to her mother and aunt. You gave her the answer she never lived to receive. I wish I'd known her better, Dominic said. Wish I'd asked the right questions when I had the chance. You're asking them now. That's what matters. Floyd came over with news. The town's officially making this a historical site. You'll get funding for maintenance, educational programs. They want to make sure the story keeps being told. Jocelyn appeared at Dominic's side, her arm linking through his. Oscar Fry called. The story's being picked up nationally. He thinks there might be a book deal if you're interested. I don't know about that, Dominic said. But maybe it was important to reach beyond Milldale, to make sure the lesson traveled further than this small town. As the crowd thinned and evening approached, Dominic walked through the cemetery one last time. He visited Annalise and Grace's graves, still covered with flowers from the day's service. Then he walked to a newer section, where another headstone had been placed recently. Cora Lawson, 1978-2023, beloved wife and mother. He'd had her remains moved here to rest near the church where he'd found his purpose. Near the family she'd never known she had. I found my way back, he told her, touching the cool stone. Just like you always believed I would. And Joss is here. She's okay. We're both okay. Jocelyn came to stand beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. They stood together in the fading light, a father and daughter reunited, honoring the past while facing toward the future. The church bell rang, newly repaired, its voice clear and strong. Dominic had learned it had been silent since 1974, its clapper removed when the church was abandoned. Now it rang again, calling out across the valley, announcing that truth had returned to Milldale. And in that ringing, Dominic heard something more than just a bell. He heard voices remembered, lives honored, a promise kept,